For most of modern history, people believed that governments were the ultimate centers of power. Presidents signed laws, parliaments debated policies, and voters determined the direction of a nation. But over the last 4 decades, something subtle but world-changing began to unfold. A transfer of authority so quiet and gradual that most people never noticed it happening. This was the rise of corporate power, a shift that turned CEOs into the new architects of global governance. It didn't happen through revolutions or coups. It happened through influence, money, and scale. As the world became more connected, corporations grew larger than countries. A single tech company began controlling the communication of billions of people. A retail giant's supply chain became more complex than the economies of entire continents. Financial firms gained the power to decide which nations thrive and which collapse, simply by shifting capital from one market to another. Governments, bound by borders and bureaucracy, struggled to adapt. Corporations, however, had no borders, only opportunities. They moved faster, innovated quicker, and accumulated wealth at a rate no public institution could match. And with great wealth came great leverage. Political campaigns became dependent on corporate donations. Laws started being drafted with the recommendations of industry lobbyists. Policies were shaped not for citizens, but for shareholders. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, CEOs began making decisions with geopolitical consequences. They could influence elections by controlling online visibility. They could pressure governments by threatening to move factories. They could shut down speech by modifying algorithms. No president or prime minister could match their reach. This was the silent shift, the moment the world realized, too late, that government power had not disappeared. It had simply moved into corporate boardrooms. The takeover didn't happen by accident. It followed a strategic pattern, one that quietly unfolded behind closed doors, in private meetings, elite conferences, and billion-dollar negotiations. This pattern is what experts now call the corporate playbook, a step-by-step system that allowed CEOs to shape national policies without ever running for office. The first step was regulatory capture. Corporations discovered that the easiest way to control the rules was to influence the people writing them. Lobbyists, consultants, and industry experts flooded government agencies, offering technical guidance that slowly became policy. Eventually, the regulators became indistinguishable from the industries they were meant to regulate. Laws were written with loopholes big enough to drive entire industries through. The second step was institutional dependency. Over time, governments outsourced more and more responsibilities to the private sector: data storage, security systems, infrastructure, even defense technologies. Public agencies shrank. Corporate influence grew. Soon, nations relied on corporations for critical operations they could no longer perform themselves. Whoever controls essential systems controls decision-making. The third step was public influence control. Tech giants mastered the art of shaping opinion through algorithms. Platforms could amplify some voices and silence others, shifting public mood at will. This power was more effective than any propaganda ministry in history because people didn't even realize it was happening. And the final step was economic leverage. If a government passed laws corporations disliked, CEOs could respond instantly by relocating headquarters, cutting jobs, manipulating supply chains, or freezing investments. Politicians understood the message: cooperate, or your economy suffers. Through these four mechanisms, corporate leaders didn't just influence policy, they became its architects. They didn't need to win elections. They simply rewrote the system to favor themselves. This was not a coup. It was a quiet restructuring of global power. By the time the world realized what was happening, democracies were no longer independent decision-makers. They had become dependencies, structurally reliant on the very corporations they were supposed to regulate. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was slow, administrative, and entirely legal. But its impact was enormous. The digital revolution accelerated everything. Governments needed tech infrastructure, data security, cloud storage, communication tools, and advanced defense systems that no public agency could build. Corporations stepped in, offering solutions that quickly became essential national infrastructure. And once a nation depends on a company for its digital backbone, it cannot easily push back. When a government tried to challenge a dominant corporation, perhaps through new taxes, restrictions, or investigations, The corporation often had a powerful countermove: comply, or we shut down your country's systems. This wasn't an empty threat. Big tech controlled digital IDs, hospital data, educational systems, tax software, payment networks, logistics systems, and even election infrastructure. Pull one plug, and half the country stalls. The result was a new form of political reality: governments cooperating out of fear, not choice. Every negotiation shifted in favor of CEOs. Every policy discussion began with what corporations required. Every legislative attempt came with a warning about economic consequences. Meanwhile, global corporations operated across borders, but governments did not. A company could leave a country instantly. A nation could not relocate its citizens. This imbalance created a world where politicians became managers and corporations became sovereign entities. Public leaders still gave speeches. They still debated laws. They still appeared to be in control. But the real power rested with those who controlled the digital pipes, the data flows, the supply chains, and the algorithms. Democracy didn't collapse. It simply became a subsidiary. In the 21st century, a new kind of political power emerged, one that didn't need borders, flags, elections, or constitutions. These were private governments, built not by nations, but by corporations. Their citizens weren't voters, they were users. Their territories weren't physical, they were digital ecosystems. And their laws weren't passed by parliaments. They were hidden inside algorithms, terms of service, and AI policies. Tech giants realized something profound. If 1 billion people rely on your platform, you don't need to win elections to rule them. Every major platform, from social media to e-commerce to cloud computing, slowly evolved into a miniature government. They created their own courts, content moderation teams, their own police, AI enforcement bots, their own currency, digital tokens and payment systems, and their own borders, login walls and access permissions. Some even created their own diplomatic networks, negotiating with national governments as equals. And unlike traditional governments, these corporate nations had something far more powerful than armies: data. Data allowed them to predict behavior, shape public opinion, influence elections, and control social narratives in ways no government in history could achieve. If a company could shadow ban a movement, deplatform a leader, or amplify a message to 1 billion screens overnight, what was that if not political power? Meanwhile, elected leaders faced a dilemma. They could regulate these tech giants, but regulation risked destabilizing their own economies and infrastructure. Or they could partner with them and quietly surrender authority. Most countries chose the second option. By 2030, some corporations had more global influence than all but the largest nations. They set global standards. They controlled critical digital infrastructure. They owned the communication channels through which society talked, thought, and organized itself. They weren't just companies anymore. They were sovereign actors, private empires with public power. In the old world, presidents and prime ministers were seen as the most powerful people alive. But in the new economic order, real authority doesn't belong to those who give speeches. It belongs to those who control platforms, supply chains, energy networks, and financial systems. Today, the most influential decisions shaping humanity aren't made in parliaments. They're made in corporate boardrooms. CEOs of megacorporations now operate like modern monarchs. They command global workforces larger than the armies of many countries. Their platforms influence elections, shape cultural trends, and decide what billions of people see, think, and believe. With a single policy change, an algorithm tweak, a new data rule, a market withdrawal, they can alter the daily lives of entire nations. But their power goes beyond economics. They are the gatekeepers of digital identity, communication, information flow, cloud storage, pharmaceuticals, food production, logistics, and even space infrastructure. They influence governments by lobbying, funding political campaigns, negotiating trade terms, and controlling technologies that nations desperately depend on. This shift created a new kind of global hierarchy. Presidents depend on corporations more than corporations depend on presidents. And because CEOs are not elected, not accountable to citizens, and not restricted by national borders, their power is both immense and largely unchecked. In this new world, leadership is no longer about winning votes. It's about controlling systems. Laws shape society, but platforms shape reality. And those who control reality are the true rulers of the 21st century.